They say the West was forged by men who spoke through gun barrels and bled for land that never belonged to them. Men who chased gold, justice, and glory, usually dying before they caught any of it. But that's only half the story. The rest was written by women the world wasn't ready to remember. They weren't called dangerous because they robbed banks or held up trains. They were called dangerous because they lived in ways the world said they shouldn't, because they refused to wait their turn, because they could survive without anyone's permission. History sings the names of its favorite sons: Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Butch Cassidy. But between those echoes or stories the wine still whispers. Women who carried knives under corsettes, who could read a man's soul faster than he could draw his gun. Women who built towns, burned bridges, and taught the desert what endurance really meant. Some rode alongside killers, some rode alone, some didn't carry a gun at all, but their silence could cut deeper than any blade. They didn't crave fame, or mercy, or forgiveness. They wanted something far rarer out here: the right to exist on their own terms. There were those who ran saloons, where secrets were the real currency, who gambled with fortunes made off men who thought they were in control. There were women who ran trading posts, who fixed their gaze on every drifter that walked in and already knew which one would lie, which one would beg, and which one would break. The West was a hard land, full of dust, hunger, and broken promises, but it broke men faster than it broke women, because men needed it to love them back. Women just needed it to stop getting in their way. They weren't saints, and they weren't side stories. They were the pulse in a dying frontier, the kind of danger that didn't shout, it endured. When night fell across the plains, you could hear their ghosts in the wind: the mail carrier, who fought off wolves; the gambler who took men's fortunes and never flinched; the ranch widow, who built an empire on the bones of those who doubted her. They were called every name the world could find to shame them, but never weak, never small. Outlaws got their legends. These women got erased, because a man who breaks the law can be punished, but a woman who breaks the order of things, she's a threat to everything the West believed in. They didn't fight for justice. They fought to live, and that's a far deadlier cause. The frontier could kill a man with a bad decision, but to outlast it, to carve out freedom where none was offered, that took something sharper than a gun and harder than steel. That's why they were feared. Not because they were violent, but because they were unyielding. This isn't the West you learned in books. This is the one built by the forgotten, the fierce, the unbroken, the ones too wild to be remembered kindly. The Wild West wasn't a place for softness. It was a graveyard for gentleness, a land that swallowed the kind-hearted first. Women were few, and those who came rarely came by choice. Some followed wagon trains west with dreams that died before the first river crossing. Some were dragged by circumstance, widowed, abandoned, or promised to men they barely knew. And some simply ran, chasing the edge of the map because everything behind them had already burned. Out there, mercy was a language no one spoke. Rain didn't fall when you needed it. Food spoiled faster than hope. And childbirth, it was a gamble between life and the grave. There were no doctors, no midwives, no clean water, just grit, prayer, and the will to see another sunrise. They buried children by the trail and kept walking. They cooked with tears, mended with blood, and learned that a kind heart was a weakness the frontier could smell a mile away. So they hardened. They learned to shoot, to trade, to bury without breaking. And slowly, the land that tried to starve them began to fear them instead. Cynthia and Parker knew what it meant to be taken and remade by the wild. Stolen by Comanche raiders at 9, she grew into the plains, a captive turned warrior, mother, and ghost to the world that lost her. When they finally found her years later, she didn't recognize the life she was supposed to return to. The wilderness had become her blood, and no amount of civilization could wash it out. Then there was Mary Fields. They called her Stagecoach Mary. Born into chains, freed by her own will, she carried mail through snow, wolves, and drunks too foolish to cross her. She smoked cigars, wore a revolver on her hip, and beat any man who called her weak. The frontier tried to break her spirit, but she became its reflection, rough, unyielding, and carved from stone. Women like them didn't ask to be part of history. They were history, written in calloused hands and sleepless nights. They didn't need anyone to defend them. They learned that the only promise the West ever kept was that no one was coming to save you. The men had laws, written, sworn, and enforced with bullets, but those laws were never meant for women. They protected land, cattle, and pride, not survival, not justice. So when those laws failed them, they built their own. Laws born of instinct, pain, and endurance. Rules made not to preserve order, but to keep breathing one more day, in a world that didn't care if they did. And that's where the danger began, because a woman with nothing left to lose, living by her own rules, isn't just surviving the West, she's rewriting it. The frontier feared many things: drought, famine, the bite of winter, but nothing unsettled it more than a woman who stopped asking permission. Because when a woman stopped fearing hunger, death, or disgrace, The West had no weapon left to use against her, and that's when she became dangerous. Stagecoach Mary knew that kind of danger well. Born into bondage, freed by her own hands, she carved a life in the rough country, with nothing but her will and her fists. When the railroad came and men spat on her, for being too old, too black, too female, she walked into the postmaster's office, and demanded the hardest route they had. They gave it to her, thinking it would finish her. Instead, it made her legend. She rode that mail through mountains and blizzards, through wolves and whiskey-fueled drunks. She carried a rifle, a revolver, and a reputation no one wanted to test twice. When a man blocked her path, she hit him once, just once, and he didn't stand again for 2 days. They said she could curse in 5 languages and shoot in 6, but beneath the grit and smoke, she carried something the West never understood, a quiet dignity born from survival. She wasn't trying to prove anything, she was simply living the way the world told her she couldn't, and that made her terrifying. Then came Pearl Hart, the so-called lady bandit, pretty enough to charm a crowd, bold enough to rob a stagecoach. They said she was polite about it, made the passengers hand over their money, then gave a few coins back so they could afford dinner. When she was caught, she didn't cry or plead. She smiled. The newspapers loved her. They called her wicked, clever, a disgrace, a wonder. In court, she looked the judge in the eye, and said, "I shall never be free, for the world has no place for women like me." And she was right, because she didn't steal for greed. She stole because the world had already stolen her choices. That's what the West never understood. That defiance wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was survival turned inside out. When society locked every door, these women learned how to break windows instead. Their defiance wasn't loud. It was deliberate, measured, and unstoppable. They didn't want to be men, they just refused to be owned by them. And for a land built on power, there was nothing more terrifying than a woman who no longer feared the cost of freedom. The men rode to prove their legend. The women rode because standing still meant dying, and every mile they covered, every rule they broke, became another crack in the world that tried to contain them. By the time the dust settled, the outlaws were dead, the lawmen forgotten, but their stories, the women's stories, still moved through the plains like wind over dry bones. Because you can kill a legend made of flesh, but not one built on defiance. The West liked to believe danger wore spurs, and smelled of gunpowder, but sometimes, it wore perfume, and carried a steady aim. Violence was never the danger, power was, and few understood that better than the women who learned to use both. Take Calamity Jane, rough as the whiskey she drank, loyal as a dying horse, and twice as unpredictable. She rode with soldiers, gamblers, and drifters, never asking for a place among them, just taking one. They laughed at her, called her filthy, wild, and ladylike, yet when the bullets started flying, she was the only one still standing. She didn't need to prove she was one of the boys, she just needed to survive in a world that only respected death and daring. Then there was Annie Oakley, the woman who made gunfire look like grace. Tiny, soft-spoken, and deadly at 100 paces. Men tried to outshoot her, outalk her, outshine her, none of them succeeded. They called her Little Sure Shot, but that name barely scratched the surface. She was more than a trick shooter. She was proof that precision and patience could outmatch brute force every single time. When Annie raised her rifle, the crowd didn't just see skill, they saw possibility, and that frightened them, because the moment she pulled the trigger, every man watching realized how fragile his idea of power really was. Calamity Jane and Annie Oakley, two sides of the same coin, chaos and control. One lived by the bottle, the other by discipline, but both tore through the boundaries of what a woman was supposed to be. They made their names louder than the laws that tried to silence them, and the whispers followed, men saying the frontier was changing, that women were forgetting their place. But they were wrong. Women weren't forgetting, they were remembering what had always been true, that survival has no gender, that courage doesn't care what you wear when you bleed. The West didn't know what to do with that truth. It could hang an outlaw, it could cage a thief, but it couldn't contain a woman who refused to bow. Because when a man broke the law, it was a crime. When a woman broke the rules, it was a revolution. Gun smoke fades, legends die, but the image of a woman standing tall in the dust, calm, unafraid, and certain, that never leaves a man's mind. Outlaws could be buried, but a woman who learned to fight like them, and live without apology, she couldn't be erased. The West loved its lawmen, badges that gleamed, boots that thundered, guns that spoke louder than reason. But even the law had its limits. It could handle killers and thieves, but it had no defense against a woman who refused to be controlled. The real threat wasn't violence, it was independence. A woman who didn't need protection, permission, or forgiveness was the one thing every man with a badge couldn't arrest. Bellstar knew that truth better than anyone. They called her the Bandit Queen, but her crimes were never what truly unsettled the law. It wasn't the horses she stole or the men she rode with, It was the fact that she could command them, that she could walk into a room full of killers and make them listen, that she didn't need a gun to pull the trigger on their pride. Belle grew up educated, sharp, and bold. She played piano, rode horses, and later, ran with men the law couldn't tame. When her husband was hunted, she hid him. When he died, she didn't mourn, she took over. She ran her own outlaw network, trading loyalty for silence and respect. The newspapers called her a temptress, a witch, a criminal, because they couldn't call her what she really was: powerful. For every man the law chased with guns, there was a woman the law chased with gossip. And gossip cut deeper. It could stain reputations faster than bullets. It could destroy a woman's name long before she ever saw a courtroom. In the 1800s, a man could shoot another man and still dine with society the next week. A woman could speak too loudly, dress too boldly, or live too freely, and find herself branded worse than any outlaw. The law didn't just punish what women did, it punished what they represented. A world where obedience wasn't guaranteed. A world where the rules didn't bend one way anymore. So they called women like Belle dangerous, not because she stole or fought, but because she led. Because she could make men follow her, not with fear, but with fascination. They could hang a thief, but they couldn't hang an idea. And Belle Starr was an idea with boots on, that freedom wasn't something a man could give, and no one could take it back once you'd tasted it. In a time when a woman's worth was measured by silence, she built a legend out of noise. The lawmen wrote her down as a criminal. History tried to write her off as a cautionary tale. But the truth, she was a storm the West still remembers. Not for what she stole, but for what she refused to surrender. Because once a woman learns she doesn't need the law to protect her, she becomes something far more dangerous than any outlaw ever could be. Frontier justice was simple. If you were a man, you could duel, steal, kill, and still be called honorable if you died standing. But if you were a woman, the same courage became crime, the same defiance became sin. In the West, there wasn't much law, just men with power and guns deciding what right looked like that day. They called it justice, but it was really ownership dressed in a badge. And when women stopped playing by those rules, the law came down harder than any bullet ever could. A man who shot in anger was called fierce. A woman who raised her voice was called unstable. A man who took what he wanted was daring. A woman who wanted more than she was given, dangerous. The gallows, the gossip, the gun, all tools of the same order, not to punish crime, but to remind every woman what her place was supposed to be. Some learned to live within that shadow, others set it on fire. There was Jane Kirkham, widowed before she turned 20. Her husband left her nothing but debt and dust. The town said she should remarry, find a man to carry her name. Instead, she opened a trading post, ran freight wagons through outlaw country, and kept a revolver under her counter for anyone who called her girl. The sheriff came once to collect taxes that didn't exist. He left with a bullet hole in his hat, and a promise never to come back. Then there was Kate Elder, known by her nickname, Big Nose Kate. History remembers her only as Doc Holliday's lover, but few mention that she saved his life more than once, that she ran a saloon, fought off soldiers, and stood her ground in a world that spat on her name. When they jailed her for vagrancy, she broke out. When they called her a criminal, she laughed, because to her, surviving without a man's protection was the real crime. These women didn't need permission to fight, they just needed a reason. And the frontier gave them plenty. They faced courts that never listened, laws that never protected, and judges who looked at them like property that had wandered too far from its owner. The word, justice, was carved by men who'd never seen what it cost a woman to live free. Every trial was theater, every sentence a warning to others watching in silence. The message was clear: the West could handle outlaws, but it couldn't handle women who thought for themselves. Because every time a woman stood up, she made the men in power look smaller. Every time she broke a rule, she proved the rules were fragile. And every time she survived, she reminded the world that the so-called justice of the West was never meant to serve her, only to cage her. Frontier justice didn't hang women because they were wicked, it hung them because they were unyielding, because they made the gallows tremble with defiance instead of fear. When the dust settled on those trials, when the crowds went home, the lawmen wrote their reports and called it order restored. But the truth lingered, like smoke in the wind. Every woman they silenced only made the others stronger. Every one they buried became a whisper in the ear of the next generation, a whisper that said, they can't hang us all. And that's what the law feared most, not rebellion, not bullets, but legacy. Because once a single woman proved she could live outside their rules, every other woman began to wonder why she couldn't too. The world told them to bow, they stood. The world told them to be quiet, they spoke. And when the world raised its hand, they didn't flinch, because every rule made to cage them was built on the belief that they'd never dare to fight back. And when they did, the West itself blinked. The stories were whispered across dusty trails and saloon corners of women who refused to die small. There was Eleanor Dumont, they called her Madame Mustache. She wasn't born into wealth or power. She built it with her hands, her wit, and a deck of cards. She opened gambling houses when women weren't allowed to own property. Men came to her tables thinking she was a novelty. They left broke, speechless, and humiliated. She didn't cheat, she didn't need to. Her sharp mind was her weapon, and her charm was the holster. When laws tried to shut her down, she packed up and built another empire in the next town. They said she was scandalous. She said she was free. Then came Sally Skull, a horse trader, sharp as a whip and twice as loud. She rode better than most men, shot straighter than all of them, and made her living cutting deals nobody dared make with a woman. When someone tried to cheat her, they didn't live long enough to try again. Rumor said she killed 2 husbands. The records don't prove it, but nobody in Texas ever asked her twice about it. These women didn't fight for fame or fortune. They fought because no one else would stand for them. They fought for space to breathe in a land that gave them none. They fought because the world took everything from them and expected gratitude in return. The men who tried to shame them ended up speaking their names in whispers. Because when a woman fights not for pride, but for survival, she becomes something larger than life, something no bullet or law can touch. Every act of defiance became legend. Every rumor became proof of power. And with every woman who refused to yield, the line between outlaw and hero blurred a little more. By the late 1800s, even men began to admit, what the law wouldn't, that the most dangerous souls in the West weren't the ones with guns. They were the ones who had nothing left to lose. These women didn't ask for equality. They took it, one scar, one victory, one act of rebellion at a time. They fought the world that said, no, and the world blinked first. History tried to silence them. It called them mad, unholy, immoral, because there was no word yet for unafraid. But the West remembers in strange ways. It forgets names, but not power. It buries bones, but not fire. And the fire these women lit still burns in every story told about the frontier that refused to die. Because when the dust settled and the smoke cleared, the West had to face a truth it could never write down, that freedom didn't have a gender. It had grit and a heartbeat and a woman's name whispered through the wind. They fought the world, and the world blinked first. Freedom in the West was never free. Every step these women took into the open cost them something they could never get back. The men who broke laws were hunted, but the women who broke expectations, they were erased. Not by bullets, but by silence, by pages torn out, names rewritten, stories twisted into warnings. The West had no mercy for women who stood too tall, and those who refused to kneel learned what it meant to stand alone. The West had no mercy for women who stood too tall, and those who refused to kneel learned what it meant to stand alone. Take Belle Starr, the bandit queen. When her legend grew too large to ignore, the papers turned against her. They called her a seductress, a witch, a traitor to womanhood. When she was shot in the back, cold and sudden, no lawman looked for the killer. They said she deserved it, because to the West, a woman who lived wild was never seen as murdered, only punished. Stagecoach Mary lived long enough to see her own strength turned into spectacle. They called her brave to her face, but whispered words like unnatural behind her back. A woman hauling mail through blizzards and outlaws. That wasn't supposed to exist. She carried the weight of every insult like another sack on her shoulder, and still delivered the mail on time. Even those who survived the bullets didn't escape the judgment. Society had a quieter way of killing. It waited for you to grow old, then pretended you were never dangerous. Women like Pearl Hart, she robbed one stagecoach, but it was her trial that made headlines. She smiled in court, cracked jokes with the jury, and said she only did what she had to do. They sentenced her, of course, but her charm made her a celebrity for a moment, and that was unforgivable. When she vanished after her release, no one looked for her either. The world loses interest in women who stop performing their defiance. Defiance always has a price, not just in death, but in memory. They burned bright, then were buried in rumors and lies to make sure no one followed. But even in silence, their ghosts refused to fade, because every frontier woman who stood her ground left a mark too deep for time to cover. They didn't die noble deaths in history books. They died tired, uncelebrated, sometimes nameless, but every man who called them dangerous proved that they'd already won, because danger is just what the world calls women who can't be controlled. The price of defiance wasn't fame, it was freedom, and that freedom came soaked in solitude. Many of them lived with guns under their pillows, sleeping light, trusting no one but the wind. No parades, no monuments, no gravestones that told the truth. But if you walk the ruins of those towns today, the ones swallowed by dust and silence, you can still feel it. That defiance, that quiet, furious heartbeat beneath the ground. It's in the echo of their footsteps, in the whisper of their names the world tried to forget. Belle, Mary, Pearl, Kate, Sally. Names that history buried, but the earth still remembers. Because freedom doesn't care who writes the books. It remembers who bled for it, and the women of the frontier bled more than anyone. They paid the price, and bought a kind of immortality the world never meant to give them. The frontier is gone now, the trails paved, the dust long settled, but some fires don't go out just because time passed. The women who broke the rules didn't vanish when their names were erased. They lived on in the bones of every woman who refused to be told who she could be. Their legacy isn't in museums or textbooks, it's in the blood of every soul that dares to stand uninvited. The West tried to forget them, but their ghosts became teachers, not of gentleness, but of grit, defiance, and the quiet kind of strength that never needed witnesses. You can see them in every woman who builds her life on her own terms, in every girl who walks into a room without apology, in every story where survival doesn't ask permission first. They taught the world that being dangerous wasn't about violence, it was about power, the kind of power that doesn't need validation, the kind that can't be outlawed. Bellstar didn't die in vain. Her name whispered through decades, teaching that leadership has no gender. Stagecoach Mary's story rode further than her male roots, proving that courage can carry weight no man could. Pearl Hart's rebellion echoed in the laughter of every woman who ever dared to want more. And those whose names are lost, they're still here too, woven into the fabric of every freedom the world now takes for granted. The men they rode beside, their statues crumble, their legends fade, but the women, the ones who weren't supposed to last, still haunt the wind, because what they fought for wasn't gold or fame. It was existence. It was the right to breathe freely in a land that never offered air. Their stories remind us that progress isn't polite, it's forged by those willing to be misunderstood, by those willing to carry the burden of being called too much. They left behind a legacy built on rebellion and resilience, proof that history can be bent, and truth can be dug out from under centuries of silence. They weren't saints, they weren't villains, they were something rarer, people who refused to break, and that refusal changed everything. Because when one woman stood up in the dust and said, no, the world had to learn a new word for power. That's the legacy, not the gunfights, not the wanted posters, but the awakening, that quiet moment when the frontier realized the most dangerous thing it ever faced wasn't a gunman, it was a woman who knew her worth. The West may have buried their bones, but it never buried their truth, and that truth still rides, unseen and tamed, through every heart that beats against the rules. They were called dangerous, and maybe they were, but sometimes danger is just another word for freedom. The frontier is gone now, the trails paved, the dust long settled, but some fires don't go out just because time passed. The women who broke the rules didn't vanish when their names were erased. They lived on in the bones of every woman who refused to be told who she could be. Their legacy isn't in museums or textbooks, it's in the blood of every soul that dares to stand uninvited. The West tried to forget them, but their ghosts became teachers, not of gentleness, but of grit, defiance, and the quiet kind of strength that never needed witnesses. You can see them in every woman who builds her life on her own terms, in every girl who walks into a room without apology, in every story where survival doesn't ask permission first. They taught the world that being dangerous wasn't about violence, it was about power, the kind of power that doesn't need validation, the kind that can't be outlawed. Bellstar didn't die in vain. Her name whispered through decades, teaching that leadership has no gender. Stagecoach Mary's story rode further than her male roots, proving that courage can carry weight no man could. Pearl Hart's rebellion echoed in the laughter of every woman who ever dared to want more. And those whose names are lost, they're still here too, woven into the fabric of every freedom the world now takes for granted. The men they rode beside, their statues crumble, their legends fade, but the women, the ones who weren't supposed to last, still haunt the wind, because what they fought for wasn't gold or fame. It was existence. It was the right to breathe freely in a land that never offered air. Their stories remind us that progress isn't polite, it's forged by those willing to be misunderstood, by those willing to carry the burden of being called too much. They left behind a legacy built on rebellion and resilience, proof that history can be bent, and truth can be dug out from under centuries of silence. They weren't saints, they weren't villains, they were something rarer, people who refused to break, and that refusal changed everything. Because when one woman stood up in the dust and said, no, the world had to learn a new word for power. That's the legacy, not the gunfights, not the wanted posters, but the awakening, that quiet moment when the frontier realized the most dangerous thing it ever faced wasn't a gunman, it was a woman who knew her worth. The West may have buried their bones, but it never buried their truth, and that truth still rides, unseen and tamed, through every heart that beats against the rules. They were called dangerous, and maybe they were, but sometimes danger is just another word for freedom.